Stanford University.
Welcome to tonight's Cafe Scientifique at Stanford Blood Center. My name is Kevin O'Neill in the Marketing and Communications Department. Stanford Blood Center is part of the Pathology Department within the Stanford University School of Medicine. It is the primary supplier of blood products to Stanford Medical Center, which is the second largest user of blood products in our nation, as well as to 4 other major hospitals in our community. Of the 85 blood centers in the United States, 2 are community blood product providers and have a blood research mission, Stanford Blood Center being one of them. Our success would not have been possible without the faithful blood donors, many of whom are here this evening. Thank you all. This evening, we are privileged to have to introduce our physician writers, and Dr. Hans Steiner will be doing the introductions. Dr. Steiner earned his MD at the University of Vienna in Austria. He completed psychiatry residencies at both the State University of New York Upstate Medical Center and at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. He is currently an active professor emeritus of psychiatry here at Stanford. He is an expert on treating adolescents as well as eating disorders. He is a founding member of the Pegasus Physician Writers and will introduce our readers. Please welcome Dr. Hans Steiner.
Thank you. Good evening and welcome to our reading of the Pegasus Physician Writers. Before we get going, I just want to tell you a little bit about the group and how it came about and what its purpose is. We are a group of some 65 physicians at Stanford that fulfill 2 criteria. We're doctors, practicing doctors of a variety of specialties, and we're also active writers. We write poetry, creative fiction, and non-creative pieces. Tonight, we're going to hear pieces that have not been read before. Some of them are published, and I will sort of indicate when that happens. Our main mission is to sort of bring the humanities to medicine and integrate it into medical training, because we all believe that to be a really good doctor, you have to know how to write about your experiences, because what that does is essentially train your capacity for empathy. And we have about 5 or 6 readings a year. They are advertised on our website, which you easily find by putting in Pegasus Physicians at Stanford. And they usually happen in museums on campus here. They're free of charge and very easily accessible. We also have with us Audrey Shafer, who's a professor of anesthesiology. She practices right next door at the VA mostly. But most importantly, she is the director of the Medicine and the Muse program, which is the umbrella program under which we all operate. And I'm sure at the end of the presentation, you'll see a little bit about Medicine and the Muse. Tonight, we have a series of readings on the stuff of life. Hope when you need it most. That was the sort of title that came to mind when we were thinking about blood. That's the way we usually do these things. We tell all the groups, okay, here's the medical topic, who's writing something about it, or who has written something about it. Then people submit, and then we select. And it is my very, very great pleasure to welcome our panel for tonight. Starting with Dr. William Meffert, who's a surgeon. And as you will see, we call him Hemingway for short. His prose is very much modeled after that particular writer. He's terse and to the point, and he brings a tremendous amount of humanity to his craft, which you will see practiced under very adverse circumstances. Our second reader is going to be Audrey Shafer. As I said, she's a professor of anesthesiology, and she is an award-winning poet. She's going to read to us three of her poems that actually have won a variety of awards, as you can see in the references provided in the handout. The way I always like to think of Audrey is she has an unbelievable talent for bringing beauty and grace to the most disgusting subjects in medicine. Then we hear from Randall Weingarten, who we call our poet laureate in the group. He's read on many of our previous readings, and his contribution tonight is The River of Life, which, as you can tell, is a poem about blood and its function. He's an expert in tea ceremony and a practicing psychiatrist in the faculty at Stanford for many, many years. And finally, we will hear from Ward Trueblood, also a surgeon, who spent a significant amount of time as a very, very young man, as a medical student, in fact, in Vietnam on the front lines. And I think he's going to tell us a little bit about that in the story tonight, along with that wonderful picture that comes with the story. Ward is currently completing a somewhat fictionalized biography, would you say, or just straight bio? Okay, he thinks it's straight. Psychiatrists, of course, know that that's not true, but that's okay. And it is forthcoming. When do we know yet? Publication date? Soon, very soon. You're in the end run. And so what we're going to do is each one of these wonderful people is going to step up. You have their bios in the handout. They're going to step up, start their reading. You may hold your questions until the very end. Don't hold your applause after they read. And when we're done, we have a little Q&A and hear from Audrey. Please welcome the panel of the Pegasus Physicians.
Thank you for the privilege of the floor, Kevin and Hans. Tonight I thought I would present a case that I hadn't seen exactly, but I've seen many partial histories with the same type of injury. I went to Da Nang about less than a month after I finished my surgical residency. And over the ensuing year, operated on hundreds of casualties, I would guess 600, though I didn't keep count. Sometimes in our A&D or emergency room, we had over 50 casualties at a time. We were an evacuation hospital with 300 beds in Da Nang. And most of my work was with large blood vessels or torso or chest injuries. Most chest injuries were fatal, so it was mostly vascular work and abdominal work. And I saw two kinds of patients. One, the physically wounded, no matter how grievous, most of the time they would survive. And they could carry on with successful surgery and physical therapy and rehabilitation. They could carry on useful lives. But then that's quite different to have a severe physical and mental injury. And we saw lots of those too, unfortunately. Lots of head wounds, open head wounds, and closed head wounds where some cerebral tissue would be coming out of the auditory canal, and the patient obviously unconscious. And although I didn't treat those patients, I decided to write a story about one of them because I was interested in their long-term outcome and how far the recovery would go. This is entitled The Class of '65. Carl was unconscious, his head, legs, and right arm wrapped in dense white bandages. He had been in that hospital for months. When Carl's letters to Margie, his high school sweetheart, no longer arrived, when he found out what had happened, how he had been badly wounded in a grenade attack, she went to see him many times. She would caress his face and whisper she loved him. Margie saw the deep head gashes, the drifting of his opened eyes, the healing arm and leg wounds. Grasping his hands, squeezing them gently, she bent closer. Carl, Carl. Was there a response? Perhaps, but no one could arouse him from a coma as months passed. The doctors offered no hope because of severe brain damage. Finally, she no longer visited, but wrote to him, hoping someone would read to him and he could somehow understand. He could still smell her soft, blossoming perfume, her soap, her clothing, even her sweat. It all blended together in his damaged mind. She had watched over him on her family's farm, where he had worked as a hired hand. If you need to fix a tractor or a harvester, remember to take your gloves off, she would say. They can get caught. Shut off the engine. Honey, you'll be working late tonight. Why not stay for dinner? Lying there, he could see Margie driving the old Ford pickup, stopping in a field where in the fading light of late afternoon, he plowed the soft black earth still moist from winter snows. I brought you coffee and some fresh bread and jam, she had said. Smiling, he opened the passenger door and got in beside her, pushing the gear shift out of the way. Their lean bodies intertwined, leaving the snack untouched. My God, she's hot, just beautiful, he thought. Pulling his shirt on her, she drove slowly away. Steering with her knees, she buttoned her blouse and looked back through the rearview window with a teasing smile. Something touched his face softly. He turned his head away. Was it the jungle? A thin wire trigger of a booby trap? Then again, more of a caress, a woman's voice. Carl, Carl, can you hear me? Move your right arm, squeeze my hand with your fingers. Was it his Vietnamese lover, Lai Tien? No, he had seen her body after the rocket attack and the ritual of placing money and rice in her mouth. Her thin, graceful body wrapped in white, gently laid in her casket, the blood and dust cleansed away. A nurse, a comforting voice he heard before. Maybe Margie was there. Maybe it was her voice. My God, he's responding, the voice again. Look at us, Carl. White coats, blurred faces. He could see. For months, he couldn't remember the past before the fog began to clear and his memory improved. That head injury, the long unconsciousness, the slow, painful physical therapy, psychotherapy, and regaining his speech. 7 years had passed since he had left home. Margie had recently written, but Carl had been too confused to respond. She had mentioned the class reunion. He didn't call or write, but now he felt better and decided to return unannounced. Driving through the rolling Iowa countryside, he saw farmers working in nearby fields. It was harvest time. Combines were sending up clouds of dust as they gathered the soybeans and corn. Margie again drifted through his mind. Slender, tall, graceful, her long blonde hair bouncing slightly as she walked. Not a cheap Hollywood beauty, pretty in a useful rather than decorative way. And he remembered plowing with the old rusty John Deere, turning his head from the icy wind to watch the thick black dirt roll into straight lines behind him, planting seeds a few weeks later. Then harvesting in the fall, keeping the corn picker straight as it ripped off ears and mowed down stalks with choking clouds of white dust, the closely following wagons filling with golden harvest. Margie had been there behind him on the tractor, her breast pressing, holding him tightly. The car wanted to cross the yellow line. You have to concentrate. But he no longer was bound to the sharp seasonal changes and working the land. The Midwest seemed another country, another assignment. He was returning the girl he had really loved, the only one who had really cared for him. Maybe he should have taken the advice of teachers like timid Mr. Howard, a high school teacher. The little bastard would peek over his bifocals and say, "Don't get in over your heads. Stay here. This is a good, honest place. You'll be a lot happier than venturing out into the unknown. Get married to a good person and stay here." He pulled into the graveled school parking lot and saw the party through the gymnasium windows. He was an observer with facial scars and gunshot hearing, who couldn't belong to the cheerful classmates gathered at serving tables heaped with food, their voices blurred and distant, smiling and hugging. Class beauties grouped together in laughter. The women athletes still looking muscular and quick, the scholars sharing their new thoughts. Most of the men, hands around each other, supporting shoulders, talking and guffing loudly, wearing boot jeans and work shirts, looking almost alike. Fats domino glared from the ceiling, where the mirrored globes slowly rotated along rippling orange and blue streamers. Flashing ceiling strobes resembled enemy rifle firings. A grotesque barbecued pig reminded him of incinerated soldiers along scorched jungle trails. He started to sweat. I found my thrill on Blueberry Hill when I found you. The moon stood still. It lingered until, but all of those vows we made were never to be. Most of his schoolmates had chosen to remain in town or nearby. They, of course, had remained friends, or at least had seen each other through the years and were not outsiders. Where was Margie? He didn't see her. With others gathered at tables or standing in small groups, an old buddy shuffled over and put his arms around Carl's chest, giving him a bear hug. Was it Charlie, Chas, or Chuck? My God, Carl, you look great for what happened. Nobody heard anything for months after you were hurt. He stepped back, glancing at Carl's damaged face, fumbling for words. You can be very proud of what you did for your country, for us. Your old girlfriend's working late at the family farm. She'll be here before long, I guess. But Carl stood erect, this relic from the past, body still hard and firm, scarred face and head. A few others recognized him. One of the beauties, Sharon, gave him a perfumed hug, pressing unsteadily against him in her gauzy red dress. Breast bulging, an earring brushing his face, she murmured into his ear, God damn, Carl, I heard about your injuries. I was so worried. But you look great. You're a fucking hero. Let's get away from this party. Go somewhere quiet, alone. The bright flashing lights, loud music, the loud unguarded talking. Carl was disoriented and confused. His head hurt, his entire body ached. Sweating, he leaned against the wall in a dim corner and edged out the exit into the soft light of the dusty harvest sunset. The kitchen lights were on when Carl drove into the farmyard. It was almost dark, but he could see the old John Deere parked near the barn, its canted front wheels now restrained by encircling weeds. No longer used, he thought, obsolete. The old hip-roof barn was still there, but quiet and dark. Perhaps it too had been abandoned. Most of the barbed wire was gone. He heard no animals. South of the faded red barn, several tall concrete silos stood next to buildings that might be used to protect the large harvest machines and the newer tractors. He walked across the gravel farmyard and along the straight sidewalk to the house front door. The evening was still quite warm, only the screen door was closed. She was working at the round oak table where they had shared evening meals, putting food and coffee into large metal boxes to take to the fields where the large machines were still rolling slowly through the darkness, gathering the crops before the first snows. He knocked on the door and called her name softly, tentatively. His head throbbed with each heartbeat. She looked up but couldn't see who was there. Just a minute, she answered, putting several boxes down and then walking to the door, switching on the lights, then throwing open the screen door. My God, oh my God, Carl. She saw scars across his face and head, his alert thinness, the way he favored his right leg. He smelled the old perfume faintly and noticed a few gray hairs, new wrinkles around her eyes. She was a little thinner now, too. Well, I'm certainly no damn prize, he thought. Vietnam did me no favors. Watchful, he was looking beyond her, guarded and careful. They embraced and kissed hesitantly. It wasn't the same as before. He rode in the pickup with her out to the fields where the gigantic harvesters lumbered along trailing clouds of dust, thrashing and roaring until suddenly shut down when the driver saw them approaching. Carl stayed in the darkened truck, leaning his aching head against the cab. The family was still together. The machines were new, but the pattern of working together, a loving dependence on each other, was the same as when he first drove that old John Deere. In Vietnam, he and his platoon had learned to understand each other with silent gestures and a few whispers, careful to avoid clumsy movements or noises, living in the safety of quiet shadows. They also had been a team, he thought, depending on each other for their lives. He belonged to something then. Later, Carl and Margie drove out of the fields and onto the blacktop leading to town. His old house was gone. The gas station was now a Quick Trip, a dim bowling alley in place of Doug's Tavern. The school's gymnasium was still brightly lit and noisy with celebrating classmates, but they didn't stop. He held his aching head and looked at Margie as she drove slowly out of town. He moved closer to her, softly caressing her neck with his left hand. "We had something special," he said. "I never stopped loving you. Even during the most dangerous times, I could see you, smell your perfume, almost touch you." She looked at Carl, his head marked with healed injuries. His thinking scared her. His new fears, the flat robotic talking. She had loved him, but now he was almost a stranger. Searching, not yet at peace, still wounded. She knew it was too late. Too much had happened. Margie's left hand wiped away her tears. He slid his arm away from her shoulder and stared silently at the dim road ahead. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much to Kevin and the Stanford Blood Center for hosting Pegasus Physician Writers, and to Hans Steiner for his amazing leadership of this ever-growing group of writer physicians. I'm going to read 3 poems, and I'd be happy to answer questions during our Q&A afterwards. Incompatibility. Doctor, blood for your patient was just returned from another operating room. The words mean this: my patient received blood incompatible with his own. Time expands as before a storm. Leaves flutter helplessly, expose their veined undersides. I see the bag, drained of color, still attached to the blood set. Sine waves saw their way across the screen. Time contracts into jagged heraldic lightning. Blood, pressure, urine, name on bag, urine, wound, pressure. Yet the pulse oximeter beats steadily, like freight cars passing. Now, 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 now. The words mean this: poison. I think at any moment the end of the train will appear around the bend. I tell surgeons bent to the dissection, nurses, eyes above masks. The winds begin to gather, trees talk a whipping language. Any moment now, blood cells will lyse. I steady myself in the thickening dark, feel huffs of air from the passing train, fluids, mannitol, send labs, check pressure, empty the urine tube again, and wait for the moment I lose him in the storm. The anesthesiologist sees pink. Moonrise in a curved pink sky, a perfect fingernail for my oximeter. A screen of pink, pink, pink obliterates the shoehorn edge of epiglottis, fiber optic frustration. Carbon dioxide pooches the umbilical hernia, a cupula between worlds, above a pink peritoneal dome. Spectra of effluvia, ascites the color of birchwood, urine blued by indigo carmine, flecks of gold in malachite bile, but one color demands intensive care: the thin pink froth of pulmonary edema flooding the accordion circuit. Inside all of us, life blushes pink and moist, our passage till black and white hardens, dry gangrene, bleached bone. Yet even as winter chills, there, just beyond my porch, November camellias bloom, pulsing pink. The third one is the off-duty anesthetist. The woman on the bus twists her arm away as if I coveted her jangly bracelet. I smile at her veins, plump rivulets, slate blue, pleasingly straight. She worries about gold, but I delight in the red flash and slide gently into the stream.
Well, a real poet laureate wants you to get up and dance on the page and try your hand at writing poems, whatever your hand may be. One of the great things about Pegasus is that we have a chance to try our hand at writing poems, prose, short novels, long novels. And we get together at least once a month and we chime in on each other's efforts. And so what I'd like to, and so everything we write is essentially something in evolution, something that's ripening. And this poem that I'd like to read is about 4 or 5 drafts before the current one that I've written. So what I'd like to do, to ask for your patience and read this poem that you have here, and then read the current draft that was done this afternoon of the same poem, and see what you feel might be worthwhile for the next draft, okay? So this is called The River of Life. Whoever said bread is the stuff of life had only a dim notion of a river of blood flowing through us all. Only when the boundaries of skin and bone are broken will that primordial river flow outward, pooling into eddies on the floor, in the bed, through the pants and dresses of our daily lives. Only then will that metaphorical staff come into play, a crooked branch to ford a rushing river. We have seen legions of children scream with fright at sight of needles, have tended warriors on battlefields, or men and women in the surgeries as blood flows outward from their wounds or from the necessary incisions. From whence cometh the coagulative energy within our arteries and veins, the gravities of stars turned into cells that staunch the bleeding or set the body on alarm? How different now the lines for blood mobiles, the precision ways for typing cells and other factors, the intricate economy of blood banking for all the tributaries of our human blood. And finally, what marvel that parade of athletes, those red-faced reticulocytes summoned from the marrow of our bones. So young, these sons and daughters of our heritage and future, so ready to make their mark within the laughing river inside us all, so quickly wizened before returning to that cosmic sea around us all. So when I read this a month or so ago at one of the Pegasus, it was like I had read a comic opera. And so this is the revision of it. And you'll see it has some bearing from the original. It's called The River of Life. I rode the Merced River in a raft till it capsized, almost lost my life with others in that churning white water. The river simply carried on, unfazed, from granite peaks to endless seas. Of the 3 great circulations in our lives, history, fate, and time itself, Our very life depends upon another circulation, that ancient invisible river of blood pulsing through the heartland in each of us. Only when the boundaries of skin and bone are broken will this primordial river flow outward, pooling into eddies on the floor, in the bed, through pants and skirts of daily lives. We have heard the cries of children when blood is taken from them with a needle, have tended warriors on battlefields or men and women in the surgeries as blood flows outward from their wounds or from the necessary incisions. Who would have known from birth to birth the unseen channels of our riverbeds, or named the names for gravity of stars turned into cells that carry energy, staunch bleeding, transport the freight of minerals and microbes within us? Who could not marvel at that parade of young athletes, all those red-faced reticulocytes summoned from the marrow in our bones to renew our life inside, each outer life we live and share, so precious and particular. Thank you.
Well, my colleagues have introduced themselves with some honesty, and I must tell you that I was a chemistry major, and I didn't read poetry in college, but I had this incredible experience being drafted to Vietnam. And about 35 years later, I started having more and more outbursts and would see a picture that would just make me weep. And my wife advised me that I needed to start writing and taking care of my old thoughts. And so this book is called Blood of the Common Sky, a young surgeon in Vietnam. I was drafted in my second year of surgical residency at the University of Pennsylvania. I went to a very primitive hospital, tent hospital, the first hospital in Vietnam. This story is about a case that came to our hospital some months later, and it was much more up to date. In fact, we had the first place anywhere that frozen blood had been used in the field. The title of this chapter is Saving Lance Corporal Shinneman. On the day in early April 1966 that Lance Corporal Perrin Shinneman came to the Naval Hospital in Da Nang, I was assisting Jerry Moss on a repair of a multi-organ abdominal case. This was the last patient to be treated out of a squad of 12 men who had been shelled the evening before, just before they had been preparing their foxholes. They had been on a mission in a river plain 10 miles northwest of Da Nang, known as Elephant Valley. That valley was a heartbreaking regular source of our casualties. The 4 ORs had run all night, and the names in the cases became another long list. We were finishing the attachment of the colon to stoma to the skin of this last patient when Moss was urgently called to triage. He found Corporal Shinneman in a state of shock from massive blood loss. He'd stepped on a landmine which had amputated his left leg at the thigh. The injury was so high there was no stump around which to place a tourniquet. The bleeding was being controlled by a corpsman who was putting pressure manually on a spurting vessel deep in the thigh. We had an empty OR, fortunately, and a waiting anesthesiologist who could take the case. I finished the belly closure of the case we were doing and then entered the adjacent room where Shinneman was being prepared for surgery. He had 2 large IVs running, and that had brought his blood pressure up to 90, a low but safe level. I took over for the corpsman who had been compressing the bleeding vessel as the mangled stump was prepared. Moss had to work close to my hand to tie off the artery. Repair of the artery was not needed because there was no lower leg to save, so we simply sutured it closed to stop the bleeding. We were faced with multiple bleeding sites in the enormous wound and went back and forth, alternating packing the wound with gauze to allow anesthesia to catch up on blood replacement, and then suturing the various bleeding points. After an hour, his situation changed, and we recognized that we were dealing with bleeding from new sites in his hip that had not been bleeding formerly. There was also recurrent bleeding from the places we had previously controlled. His blood had lost the ability to clot. He had at that point received 20 units of blood, over twice his normal blood volume. The available blood on hand was bank blood and frozen blood, neither containing the missing factors essential for clotting. Our only solution was to call for fresh blood from donors on base, but that process would take more than an hour. It would take 10 years before a process was developed for making available the necessary clotting factors, i.e. platelets and fresh frozen plasma, known as FFP, for just this situation. At the same time, Shinneman's core body temperature was dropping, a sign of his worsening state due to the extent of his wound and the loss of blood. We made the hard choice of ligating the femoral artery higher in the groin, which had the risk of possibly devitalizing some of the stump tissue. By doing so, we stopped the ongoing bleeding, but added the risk of poor wound healing due to the lack of circulation. Next, we placed a dressing on the short, fat stump with the hope that pressure would staunch the many oozing vessels and also help with the heat loss. Blood warmers and bed warmers were not available in Vietnam, so we used blankets that had been warmed in the autoclave. It would take time for fresh frozen blood to arrive and warming blankets to work. I stayed in the ICU several nights to oversee the massive fluid replacement he needed. His body was behaving like that of a burn patient with a large area of skin loss and leaking serous fluid from the open wounds. His loss of serous fluid, along with the massive bleeding, fortunately did not lead to irreversible multi-organ failure. Yet his condition was so unstable that we need to recalibrate his fluid replacement every 2 hours. Shinneman was too sick to be aware that he was close to death. But on the third night, between morphine shots and blood transfusion, he asked me in a lucid interval, "Will I die, Doc?" I knew I had to give him a thoughtful answer, not just a quick reassurance that he would be fine. He knew better than that. His situation was precarious and the outcome unknown. I knew that an interval between morphine injections was not the time for heart-to-heart talk. So I told Shinneman the limited truth, that he had proved amazingly resilient, and we had no intention of letting up or giving up. With that assurance, he went back to sleep. We took him back to the OR each morning for dressing change under anesthesia and to stitch any remaining bleeding points. On the fourth night, after the bleeding had been controlled, his blood pressure dropped, and he had a spike in his temperature. His heart rate was also quickened. The following morning, his white blood count was higher and his blood pressure remained low in spite of receiving more fluids. When Moss arrived in the morning, we reviewed the situation. We both knew that Shinneman had an infected wound despite his receiving antibiotics and would need another surgery. This would be a risky amputation through the hip joint. Moss went to talk to Captain Adams, our most experienced surgeon, and asked me to schedule the surgery. He did not say so, but I assumed from the unusual nature of the wound itself that he had never done such a case. I reviewed the anatomy of the hip joint and pelvis so that I could be more helpful. We were methodical, focused so completely upon this man's survival that it actually became, in a way, synonymous with our own personal survival. Each intramuscular vessel was sutured with fine vascular stitches, while the anesthesia staff rotated warm blankets on his torso to ward off hypothermia. Following his surgery, Shinneman's infection cleared, and we were able to evacuate him to Clark Air Base Hospital 10 days after his admission. He was our first patient to receive more than 100 units of blood, a new record in Da Nang. Except for an occasional direct encounter at Clark when one of us transported an unstable patient there, we rarely learned anything of our patient's fate. But this case was an exception. Shinneman went through more surgery and rehabilitation at Great Lakes Naval Hospital in Chicago. Of course, we wondered what had happened to him ultimately, and were to find out in a very special way. The day Shinneman returned to his home in South Dakota, a photo was taken of him by Ray Muse, a photographer for Sioux Falls Daily newspaper, the Argus Leader. In that picture, Shinneman is standing on one leg, clutching his wife in an embrace, his crutch having fallen to the ground. The picture was syndicated and published in Sunday newspapers in August 1966 and received national attention. When we received copies of the photo in the mail from home, everyone in our little hospital unit glowed with pride for having saved this Marine. Perry Shinneman lived a full life on one leg as a correctional officer and a volunteer at the Veterans Center in Sioux Falls. He died in Sioux Falls at age 70 in 2005, having survived his wife, Shirley. The photographer Ray Muse won many awards, including a nomination for the Pulitzer Prize for his photograph of Shinneman's return home. The photo came to symbolize for the country the whole experience of Vietnam. But for us, it symbolized the unwritten story of the battlefield medicine that had allowed him and so many others to return to productive and happy civilian life. One of the fine corpsmen on duty those nights tracked me down in an email search 30 years later to revel in our having saved Shinneman. In 2001, when Jerry Moss and I met for the first time since the war, we both recalled this case. The hurried, thoughtful, and complicated decisions that we had made in 1965 were as clear in our memories then as they had been when we made them 36 years earlier.
Okay, we'll move on to the Q&A part of our presentation this evening. So we'll pass around this microphone, and ask your questions. We'll run this till approximately 8:30. And our writers have graciously agreed to answer any questions that you may have one-on-one after 8:30. Okay.
Thank you. Well, first, thank you for sharing everybody on that. I thought it was great. I did want to ask a question about just the group in general. Do you guys, has anyone ever ventured into writing like for theater, for performance? Has that been a format you guys have gone into? And I know you're a psychiatrist, so it's like drama therapy. Is that something that interests you? And is that something that would interest a group? And I did want to say, well, I thought they were all great. I wanted to just shout out one to Dr. Meffert, that your line was it that she was beautiful in a useful way rather than a decorative one. I thought that was a great line. So I just wanted to say that before I forgot. So that's my question. So theater, drama therapy, and
I can respond to the theater question. We do have at least one writer who has written for theater, and that's Jim Locke. Wrote a piece that was produced in San Francisco. And Hans, do you know of others?
Can't force the language on them. No, I think it's a very good point. And actually, I was going to ask Ward, in your description of the whole event and in the aftermath, you essentially give us one of the criteria for PTSD. In other words, the decisions you made in that situation are sort of etched in your mind. And do you want to say a little more what writing about these things does for you? Because I think this is one of the functions writing has in all of our lives, as we're all going through these very, very difficult situations, to sit down and sort of encapsulate it in either fictional or non-fictional form or poetry helps you.
Well, I had this box of letters. I wrote my girlfriend every day, proposed to her over shortwave radio. Wrote my dad, who was a World War II Army doctor, once a week, and these letters were just off limit. I couldn't open them for about 45 years. But I think the answer is yes, it's been very helpful for my mental health to do that and write it. I've cried many times just with what I said.
I was just going to ask you, Dr. Trueblood, that the story has stayed with you and was etched in your memory, but the fact that you were able to write about it, it was much later. And so it had kind of its own traumatic effect on you. But at what point was it that you felt like you could actually put the words in writing?
Well, Rick Mamelok is sitting right here in the second row, and he was in my original poetry writing group at Stanford almost 20 years ago. And so that's when I really realized I could write poetry and condense it enough that I didn't totally fall apart. And but it began the process, and I saw value in it from the very beginning.
So Hans had mentioned at the beginning that there's an umbrella program called Medicine the Muse. It's based at the Bioethics Center, and one of the things that we do are other kinds of events, as well as education for medical students and undergraduates, outreach, music, all kinds of things. But what has been brought to mind is one of our events that we are planning for April that will be held on the Stanford campus. It's free and open to the public. It's called Honoring the Ghosts. It's being organized by Jackie Genovese. We have, through a grant from the Stanford Arts Institute, invited Roman Baca and the Exit 12 dance troupe from New York City. Roman Baca is a Marine veteran, and he directs that troupe. Much of their dance is based about war trauma and recovery. There will be a poetry reading just before that by Alex Nemerov, who's a professor of art and art history. And I encourage people to come to that. There'll be also a discussion afterwards, again, about this incredibly important topic of PTSD.
Audrey, it's a question for you. In your poetry, though, yeah, sometimes you write about very traumatic events, but what I'm more struck with whenever I read your poetry is how you sort of digest the daily ins and outs of your job, of your profession, and cast it into poetry. That woman in the subway, that's a perfect example of that. So what's the function of that sort of poetry, do you think?
Thanks, Hans. I think for me, with that poem, I was exploring the idea that one is never separated from one's role as a physician. It becomes part of you. The training becomes within you. And I think it's different for different specialists, probably. But as an anesthesiologist, I'm always looking at airways and veins, I'm sorry. And I was trying to have some fun with that and how that gets misinterpreted. But basically, I think it's important for professionals to recognize that identity with their work and career, their immersion in that, and how that might be affecting the rest of their life and the lives of people around them.
So it is difficult to turn it off. It's sort of with you all the time. Randy, what's that like for a psychiatrist?
I was actually thinking about an experience I had today. I was with a good friend and colleague who is drifting into his Alzheimer's disease. And we were having lunch together and then going to see the Anderson collection at Stanford and walking around. And as we talked, it became very clear that one of the most painful and agonizing things about his kind of evaporation is the loss of his identity as a physician, and that this has been such an intimate and intricate part of who he is as a person And it's not just like retirement, but it's an actual loss. And some part of him is just continuously grieving now. And so that what you were saying about the how in our writing and in our living, those of us who've been fortunate enough to practice medicine and continue to, it's just so much a part of who we are. And when that begins to disappear, we disappear in a way. So the other thing is everyday experiences, our dreams, our imagination, they all somehow get transformed. And I think there's a poet named Hirschfeld who says that all of us are writing poems every day, but that somehow we don't always recognize them or remember them in a sense. And so each of us have to be sensitive to the poems that our friends and colleagues and family members are writing just in their natural ways of living. So.
Thank you all for sharing tonight. I'm a PGY6 psychiatry trainee, and just been thinking a lot about the exposure involved in writing. And I think in psychiatry in particular, but I suspect in other fields of medicine, there's sort of a value in the anonymity of the clinician. Like, sort of feel like there's a hesitation for my story to be in the room before the patient's story. So I'm curious about your writing and what it's like to kind of put yourselves out there for public consumption, for your colleagues to know more about your personal stories, for potentially your patients to know more about your personal stories, and whether there's hesitation involved in that.
I was just pondering Bill Meffert's story and how this love didn't really come back together. And certainly in my case, thinking how important it was, those daily letters that allowed two people separated to be in sync all that time and share something so deeply. It's just striking.
I think that's a beautiful question because it really gets at the issue of boundaries and the risks that we take to be transparent and to allow ourselves to be intimate with others and yet still maintain the integrity of that relationship. And I think as you grow in your experience, you just honor that balance between the adventure of being intimate and yet the holding on to the frame, as we would call it, and that's so important.
I agree. That's a wonderful question. I think for me, in terms of writing, getting something outside of myself and then sharing with others, there are multiple steps there. And overall, I believe it's helped me with my interactions with patients. For example, I feel that I am far more willing to share an anecdote about my family when we're talking, and particularly in the post-operative period, when just checking on a patient to see how they're doing. And I've come to believe that that sends a message, a very important message to the patient, that I understand it's a human-human encounter. That is what medicine is, and that my willingness to be a bit vulnerable, to share a bit, is a way of saying, I care about you.
Well, I practiced for years in Iowa, and Iowa has the distinction, I think, is just a distinction of having more people over 80 than any other state of the union. And I was called upon to operate on a lot of these elderly people for major procedures like cardiac cases. And I'd never met them before, but it would be like 7 in the evening, and I'd be making evening rounds and going in to see patients for tomorrow. And it helped me to assume that I was part of the family, like I was their son, and to sit there with the family and the patient, not for very long, I didn't have very long, but to sit down maybe on the edge of the bed to look at them and to tell them what the risks were and to be part of the family. I thought it helped me a lot. It helped relieve anxiety, and I think it helped the patient. So many times, and maybe this is true in other states too, but I was so impressed by, after the explanations, the estimate of risks, that sort of thing, the patient would say, well, do the best you can, doc. And I never met the patient before 5 minutes before. And that's the way it is. And, if medicine is a great profession, and I would certainly do it again without question, despite all the unsettling changes right now. There's nothing else, no other profession I know of that forms such a solid trust between the patient and the doctor, any relationship that is anywhere near that. And as far as PTSD goes, whatever you call it, I have a youngest daughter who's a psychiatrist. She says I have PTSD, but I'm a surgeon. I don't think I do have PTSD. But anyway, I think we were shipped home too fast. I mean, I almost got killed the last 2 days in Vietnam, and the next day I was in San Francisco. And I stood behind people waiting to get on a United Airlines plane, and the service wasn't too good then, and it isn't so good now. But they were talking about whether they wanted red meat or fish for dinner on the plane. And they were upset because they weren't getting their first preference. And I had just come from Da Nang, and if I didn't make that plane, I wouldn't get home in time to see my wife, who I was still quite close to. And and the first day I was home, I guess this first week, we had a little earthquake. I was at Fort Ord, and I went flying off the bed, trying to get under the bed and looking for my flak vest. The trouble was the mattress was on the floor. We didn't have a bed frame yet. And I just think that they could have done a better job with conditioning you before you were suddenly sent home. And I think it was easier for people who had been trained in a profession already, because we could diffuse a lot of our anxieties by just getting to work and developing new interests. But what do you do when you're 18 years old and you're missing a leg and you don't have any specialty? It's a whole different situation. But for me, it was a fascinating experience, and it's been difficult to overcome, but writing has helped me also. The other thing, I thought that the children and the grandchildren would never want to sit while I told them what happened. So I thought, well, I'll start writing and put it down in writing. And then I found I got addicted to writing, and now I really can't stop. I really am a writing addiction of some sort.
It's a very good question. The person that has most struggled with this particular aspect is not with us tonight. He's part of the group, he's part of our group actually, and that's Irv Yalom. He's written several stories, and when you read his story, Love's Executioner, where his new book that's coming out February 15, Creatures of a Day, we're going to have grand rounds on it in March, on March 5th. He's very transparent with his reactions to the interaction with the patient. And then, of course, you're sort of trying to figure out, is it helpful, is it not, what I think here and how. The one thing that amazes me about his writing, and I ask him all the time, I say, how many lawsuits have you had against you? Because, all it takes is one lawyer to sit there and be sort of carefully go through these essentially transcripts of treatments. And he always says, not one, which is very encouraging. So if you're contemplating doing what he's doing, I think you're safe.
I also concur with what Hans had said, but I write poetry too. I find, as a psychiatrist, I think I find that the format of that is very freeing. In other words, in terms of not having identify any particular patient, because we share this more like a universal or communal kind of unconscious issues that if it comes out, it doesn't really pertain to any particular patient that would create any kind of issues around boundary or confidentiality. So I think the poetry format, it allows even more freedom than prose. That's my opinion.
Thank you very much. And a couple of thoughts. One is I do remember going through hard experiences and sitting down and writing poetry. And it was really transformative. And I felt very happy to have the poem. And then I seemed to be able to move on. So what you're saying, I do remember doing that. And then the poem that, were there two poems and you were wondering about what our reactions would be. And I just want to say I liked the second poem with the boat image because it felt very metaphorical, but also kind of, I could imagine the boat floating down the stream. And lately I've been a little bit trying to think about what is actually going on inside of my body with the blood. I'm not a physician. With the blood and organs and weight and food and nutrition and all of that, to think that maybe I can make better decisions. So I appreciated being able to be part of the flow of circulation.
So I want to know if anyone in the group, I mean, you obviously write what you know, but do you also use this group or this exercise as a form of escape? I mean, do you write something that has nothing to do with your profession, just as a way to, find yourself outside of your life, that your day-to-day life there, and do you share that in the group, or is it usually just focused on things that are related to your profession?
I think of myself as a poet, and I write a lot about birds and beautiful places. Oh, sure. Oh, yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.